So we have the idea of a permanent victim here, right? And Jews as victims and only victims, which of course then plays a very key role in rationalizing Israeli state violence for decades, in the ongoing Nakba, culminating eventually in the Gaza genocide now. Um, we have to understand, come to terms with something that is very, very problematic, that the international legal system that reemerged after World War II reemerged immediately by denying the Nakba. Nakba denial of mass atrocities becomes a key facet of the reemerged international legal system, flawed at the very core. It discards the voices of victims of mass atrocities, in this case Palestinians, right? And it betrays the idea of protecting victims of mass atrocities, and it betrays, of course, the idea of holding accountable perpetrators of mass atrocities.
Genocide is a new word combining the Greek word genos meaning race or group, with the root of the Latin sidere meaning to kill.
Became interested in genocide because it happened so many times.
Power is all against one. Violence is the opposite. The extreme is one against all.
This is Not to Forgive, but to Understand, a podcast series discussing genocide studies with experts and those connected to its critical questions. I am Luis Gonzalez Aponte, co-host with Saba Karim.
And what we're about is really to try to understand why evil happens, why there are perpetrations in genocidal scenarios and scenarios of mass atrocity. Not to forgive, but to understand.
Forgive, but to understand.
Not to forgive, but to understand.
Today's guest is Raz Segal, Associate Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies and Endowed Professor in the Study of Modern Genocide at Stockton University. Our conversation focuses on the future of Holocaust education after Gaza, including Holocaust exceptionalism, genocide studies, academic freedom, and the politics of historical comparison. One note before we begin. This interview was recorded before Professor Segal reached an agreement with the University of Minnesota in June 2026 to settle his claims against the university. We provide additional context on that development later in the episode and in the description below. Here is our conversation with Raz Segal.
Good morning, Raz. We're very happy to have you on the platform today to broach a very important topic, which is basically the future of Holocaust education after Gaza. We noticed since October 2023 that there have been two main topics that have kept coming up within the circles and have become the theme of various conferences across America. And these two themes are, first of all, the theme about academic silence, which we broached a few weeks ago. And also now what we're dealing with is basically Holocaust education after Gaza. When the question of the future of Holocaust education after Gaza began circulating in the genocide studies circles I frequent, I initially struggled to understand the intensity of the debate. It seemed self-evident to me, almost a matter of what one might call mind blindness, that those who were victims during the Second World War had no direct connection to the ongoing war between Israel and Palestine. These are distinct events, different actors, different geographies, different historical moments. And yet the conversation did not remain marginal. It quickly gained traction. What began as scattered discussions soon evolved into a sustained intellectual engagement, appearing in essays, academic writing, and conferences across the United States and Europe. Now it forms the basis of our podcast conversation with you. After listening to several of your interviews, one concept in particular stood out to me as capturing the core of the dilemma we now face, the idea of the permanent victim. This concept, it seems, complicates how we think about the future of Holocaust education in the context of Gaza. It introduces a set of political and moral entanglements that unsettled what I had initially taken for granted, that the Holocaust and the current war in Gaza could be understood as entirely separate. So I'd like to begin there. Could you tell us more about this concept of the permanent victim and how it reshapes the way we approach Holocaust education today?
Well, thank you so much, Saba and Luis, for inviting me to this conversation. So, look, the permanent victim, as you put it, Saba, is a very important ideological idea um, in this story. But before I dive into it, it's important to say, of course, that there's no such thing, obviously, right? The way that we imagine, um, you know, these kind of, we can say the kind of categories that we still use quite a lot in Holocaust studies and in Holocaust education and in Holocaust memory, the victims, perpetrator, bystanders. We can add other categories to this, collaborators, rescuers, right? The way that we use them as kind of fixed categories and also attach to them all kinds of, you know, um, ideas about human behavior that, of course, it only takes 5 minutes to look into, to look ourselves in the mirror in the morning to know that, human relations in life isn't like that, right? We are complex people. We don't behave according to fixed categories. We know from actually all cases of, mass atrocities and genocide that we study, that these events, these processes, these circumstances are much more messy. We know that victims can become perpetrators. We know that perpetrators can become victims. We know that bystander is a absolutely vague category that creates actually in studying genocide and also in remembering genocide and educating about genocide, the category of bystanders creates many more problems than actually provides any kind of analytical clarity, right? So there is no such thing as a permanent victim. There is no such thing as a permanent anything, right? And there's much more to say about this, historically in relation to the Holocaust, in relation to other cases. I'll just add one more thing before I dive into the ideological aspect, that of course, quite a lot of Holocaust survivors arrived in Palestine, Israel, before and during, and shortly after the 1948 war and the Nakba, through which the Israeli state was established, and fought in the 1948 war, and in some cases also participated in mass violence against Palestinians. And in any case, certainly witnessed, right, the mass violence against Palestinians in the 1948 Nakba, which, as we know, included the forced displacement, the mass deportations of at least 750,000 Palestinians. The true number is probably closer to 1 million Palestinians, the destruction of hundreds of Palestinian villages, towns, neighborhoods, in some cases, entire Palestinian cultural centers like Jaffa, like Ramle and Lid. Dozens and dozens of massacres that altogether killed about 15,000 Palestinians. So Holocaust survivors witnessed this, right? In some cases, participated in this, and that also obviously complicates, right, the idea of the permanent victim. Um, Again, there's much more to say about all of this, but let's dive into the ideological issue of the permanent victim, which is, of course, very important. So the way that, the first thing to really say about this is that um, the crime of genocide, right? The international legal system reemerges after World War II. Of course, there's a history of the international legal system well before World War II. It reemerges after World War II, and the crime of genocide is its key innovation, right? And the crime of genocide is immediately understood, right, in various ways in relation to what we now call the Holocaust. No one used the word at the time, Of course, it'll take, another about 15 years until the word enters, common usage in relation to the Nazi genocide against Jews. But the concept of genocide, even though, of course, the Holocaust does not appear in any way, actually, in any explicit way in the genocide, in the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide from 1948, but that's clearly the immediate context, right, for the emergence of the concept. And the point is that it's that the not what we call the Holocaust today, right? So the Holocaust is understood as a unique genocide immediately, right? Now, the issue of uniqueness, right, again, and well, you'll see in a minute how it's tied to the permanent victim here in a very important way. But the idea that the Holocaust is unique emerges because it serves a number of key state interests. Now, it's important to say here, just as a sidebar, that survivors themselves on the ground, Jews, also started to talk about what they had just experienced as unique, right? But from a very different perspective than the perspectives of states, okay, at the time. We have this kind of time immediately after the war where Jews are convinced for very good reasons, right, that what they had experienced will be marginalized, will be erased, will be pushed aside, will be denied, and it was in various ways actually, right? And they start one way to respond to this is that they start to kind of talk about what they had just experienced as unique. Okay. Again, there's much, much more to say about this, but I just want to mention it because it's very different than the discourse that is emerging on the state level. Okay. On the state level, what we have is, of course, the urge to make sure that the new crime of genocide does not refer to a long history of colonial genocide, right, perpetrated by European colonial powers, perpetrated, right, I mean, the basis for the US state, built on indigenous genocide, but also that the quite significant history of Soviet genocides, right? Because there's all the allies here together, right? Also does not, is not discussed, certainly not in relation to the new crime of genocide. So the hierarchy, right, that from the 1980s and really more from the 1990s, we know as Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which of course is a very bizarre title for a field, right? That hierarchy is created right with the concept of genocide in 1948 in relation to, again, what we now call the Holocaust, because it serves this interest, right, of marginalizing histories of genocide, both in the West, colonial genocides, and Soviet genocides. And of course, more immediately, it serves to marginalize the mass atrocities and arguably genocide of the Allies, again, both Western Allies and the Soviets during World War II, right? I mean, including, say, the dropping of atomic bombs, atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and of course the many, ongoing Soviet genocides during and after World War II. So there's these kind of immediate interests, right, for that really make sense to cast the Holocaust and Nazi genocide as unique. Now, this is very important because in this framework, right, if the Nazis are a unique evil, right, and their genocide is a unique genocide, the victims of that genocide, Jews, are unique victims, right? Permanent victims, we might say, in your formulation. Now, that, of course, is also supported by the idea that Jews have a special, unique place in the so-called Judeo-Christian world, right? Now, of course, we know that the Nazis, as the very important and late historian Alon Confino showed in his work, right? The Nazis aimed to destroy actually this Judeo-Christian world in order to create on its ruins the Nazi world that they envisioned. And they actually then indeed saw the Jews as unique in a negative way, right? So it also made sense in this kind of Judeo-Christian world, constantly in self-contradictions always, right? But it made sense after the war to kind of reestablish the role of Jews as unique in a positive way, right? As a response. And that, of course, supported the idea that Jews are unique victims and that they can only be victims, permanent victims, right? Now, this kind of uncompromising victimhood then was translated into ultimate morality, right? And joined in indeed in 1948, right? The year that Israel was created through the 1948 Nakba, joined a key element of the Zionist project, which was conflating a people, Jews, with a state, Israel, right? And that's the way in which now the fourth element of this uniqueness is added, which is the Israeli state. Okay? The Israeli state also becomes unique. This is what we know in the international legal system as impunity for Israel and mind-boggling impunity, right, of violations of international law for decades in front of our eyes. I mean, I always say that just the settlement project, just the post-1967 settlement project, right? And of course, the Nakba was a crude violation of international law, right? But the settlement project is like a violation, black letter law, right? You are not allowed to settle an occupying power's citizens in occupied territory, certainly not for decades and decades and decades, right? Black letter law does not require any interpretation whatsoever. It was allowed to happen for decades, of course, including massive dispossession and violence against Palestinians that is ongoing in the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip, including East Jerusalem, because of this kind of impunity. But the important thing, right, is that because of this system of uniqueness, right, Nazism, the Holocaust, Jews in Israel, then in 1948, with the new crime of genocide, the Nakba, which, as I said, Holocaust survivors had witnessed, right, as it unfolded, which everyone knew about, it wasn't a secret. Israeli Jews spoke about it freely, right? Had to be immediately denied formally in the international legal system in order to maintain the system of uniqueness, which is, of course, a key state interest. So we have the idea of a permanent victim here, right? And Jews as victims and only victims, which of course then plays a very key role in rationalizing Israeli state violence for decades, in the ongoing Nakba, culminating eventually in the Gaza genocide now. Um, we have to understand, come to terms with something that is very, very problematic, that the international legal system that reemerged after World War II reemerged immediately by denying the Nakba. Nakba denial of mass atrocities becomes a key facet of the reemerged international legal system, flawed at the very core. It discards the voices of victims of mass atrocities, in this case, Palestinians, right? And it betrays the idea of protecting victims of mass atrocities, and it betrays, of course, the idea of holding accountable perpetrators of mass atrocities, right? So this is kind of a short introduction into, the horrific and extremely violent and escalating, actually, extremely violent situation in which we find ourselves today.
Thank you very much, Raz. You brought up many different points that I'd like to, explore in detail during this conversation. First of all, I want to tackle that question. So every time I attend conferences, we bring up the topic. We talk about the fact that we want to discuss how Holocaust education will be after Gaza. But I want to know the answer concretely. How should it be different? What should the syllabus look like? How should teaching practices change? And how should us educators also train ourselves to approach the subject differently, if at all?
Look, I laugh because, it's I should really cry. And I do cry, by the way, all the time. The Holocaust education, as I just said, was flawed to put it lightly, from its inception, because it was based, as I just said, on Nakba denial, right? I mean, how does the permanent exhibition in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which I know is changing, right? But the current permanent exhibition that, has been there for a long time, how does it end? With the establishment of the Israeli state. Of course, no mention of Palestinians, no mention of the Nakba. That's how the permanent exhibition about the Holocaust in the USHMM ends, with Nakba denial, right? It's been there all the time. There's no, I mean, it's not a secret, right? Um, Holocaust education has been, in that sense, and again, it's much more complex, but in that sense, an unbelievable, horrific failure, right? And it's not that it needs to change, it needs to be completely transformed at the core, right? Now, why is it more complex? So here again, I want to touch on, there's two kind of issues uh, uh, to to think about. One is so Holocaust education, again, on the state level, was supposed to serve and did serve this ideology of Holocaust uniqueness, right? Of Nazis as complete evil. And in that sense, of us, in this case, say, if I talk about Holocaust education in the United States, us as liberators, us as the good guys. I mean, the Holocaust turns into this ridiculous Hollywood, narrative of good guys and bad guys, right? Good versus evil, where, of course, the entire history of the United States is erased, right? That it's based on indigenous genocide, ongoing indigenous dispossession and genocide, actually, right? But also the things that we know, for instance, as we know from legal scholar James Whitman, that the Nazis based their race laws, the Nuremberg laws, on American race laws, right? That the U.S. was an inspiration, of course, to the Nazis, that the US was actually a leading force since the early 20th century in eugenic research around the world, funding eugenic research around the world, including in Nazi Germany, by the way, in the 1930s, right? All this is, of course, erased out the window in this kind of Hollywood formulation. Um, and of course, the what comes with Holocaust education, this idea of never again, which is translated into the political project of genocide prevention in the West, really becomes a form of reproducing colonial control and dispossession around the world. None of this is new. Of course, many people have written and discussed this, so this is quite well known. And therefore, it was no surprise, right, in this element of Holocaust education that indeed the institutes, and we have to think about this as an institutional phenomena, right? The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is a federal institute. It's important to think, right, what do state institutes do? All state institutes, what are they committed to in their mission statements, right? To the state, of course, not to the victims of the state, right? It was no surprise, therefore, that well before October 2023, by the way, the USHMM, the most well-known incident is, of course, the USHMM's response in 2019 to Congresswoman Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, to what she said about U.S. internment camps on the U.S.-Mexico border. Uh, um, she dared in the social media post to say never again should mean something, right? And of course, there was a massive storm that erupted on social media in 2019 about this. But the important thing is the USHMM, as a response to Ocasio-Cortez, as we know, was you can never compare the Holocaust. She didn't compare the Holocaust, by the way, but it doesn't matter. You can never compare the Holocaust to anything, not in the past, not in the present, not in the future, not in the entire galaxy for that matter, right? Which was, of course, an absurd response. If you remember, it prompted a letter by Holocaust scholars from around the world. 600 scholars signed that letter, which is, by the way, an impressive achievement of the USHMM to unite, right? 600 Holocaust scholars about anything, because, of course, the people who signed this letter, otherwise you put them in the same room, they'd kill each other, right? But they all signed a letter to the USHMM saying, what is this? This is absurd, right? The statement is actually contrary to the mission of the USHMM, which is never again what you do matters, which requires comparison. So what are we talking about here at all? But there was no surprise because this is a federal institute. The boss is sitting across the street in the White House, right? So there's the same, therefore, we have to think about it in the same way that after October 7th, after the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023, the USHMM, right, since then and until today, by the way, it's not only that it has not spoken out about the unbelievable mass atrocities against Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank, by the way, which is conveniently usually forgotten in the discussions. Even now, actually, Gaza is slowly fading, into kind of back into the realm of denial. We can talk more about this as well if we have time. But it's not that the USHMM has not talked about these mass atrocities, which, of course, there's a broad consensus among genocide scholars today that it's a case of genocide, right? It's not only that there's silence in the USHMM about this, is that the USHMM has constantly provided rationalization for Israeli state violence against Palestinians, right? For the continued genocide, including the idea that Palestinians in Gaza are actually Nazis, right? This crude Israeli weaponization of the Holocaust as a justification for genocide. So on the institutional level, right, that's very much part of Holocaust education, ideologically, but both in practice, before and after October 2023, we have, well, in this sense, I have to say, not a failure. The system is actually doing exactly what it was designed to do, right? It's a failure from the common sense understanding of what Holocaust education should be, right? But this leads me to the second, where kind of to the where this things become more complicated, is that how people in society understand Holocaust education, right? Even within the realm of the system of uniqueness, right? And they, of course, understand Holocaust education actually in a much more common sense way, right? And they say, okay, the Holocaust is unique, right? However we understand this word, but sure, of course, we need to compare it because otherwise, how can we even think about never again, right? And in any common sense, again, this is all, I mean, it's incredible that we're in a time where common sense is like under attack, right? Really just basic common sense and basic decency. But common sense idea of the Holocaust is powerless people, Jews, of course, many others as well. I mean, we can think about how Roma, for instance, are completely elided from all these discussions usually. But, our powerless people are attacked by powerful states, right? And if you remember the Obama speech writer Sarah Hurwitz several months ago, or whenever it was, maybe a bit more, talked about, how how she views actually Holocaust education now as a problem, because indeed people understand from it, including younger Jews, understand from it this common sense idea that if you see powerless people under an extreme attack, facing extreme violence by a powerful state, right? That triggers something that has to do with never again, with prevention, with, and she said, and now, people are watching powerless Palestinians attacked by a powerful state, Israel, and, and that's a problem, right? That's a problem. Reality, of course, is a problem for these people. So in that sense, we can't, this complicates the picture, right? I'm not saying that Holocaust education then is just a complete failure, that we can't look just at the institutional, ideological, and the state level. We do have to think about how, even in the realm of thinking about uniqueness, which of course elides a lot of things, right? I mean, including actually education about Israel Palestine, and indeed the long history of Israeli state violence against Palestinians, the ongoing Nakba, right? And there's a lot to say about this, of course, right? In the frame of Holocaust education. Um, uh, but there is a common sense understanding of what Holocaust education is among a lot of people in society, including students in universities, right? And high school students in schools, that is now, not working well for the people who are overseeing this institutional ideological system of Holocaust education. Clearly, as Sarah Horowitz is telling us, right, it's become a problem, right? So this should figure, what I'm saying is that both of these elements, right, the institutional ideological state, understanding of Holocaust education, which has to be transformed completely, of course, right? Um, but also how Holocaust education has been understood by many people in society, in schools and universities. Both of these things have to figure in how we think about, the future of Holocaust education.
I think what the term that I have been privy to that connects to what you're saying is the term negative exceptionalism. The idea that the Holocaust is the worst of all genocides and therefore, merits more attention. Here is a problem that I struggle with as a genocide studies scholar in engaging with people about, this conversation, this discussion, which is basically we're dealing with people at different levels. We're dealing with the public, as you mentioned earlier when you talked about, common sense. We're dealing with academics and academics who operate at different levels again. How do we navigate all of this if we want to come up with something standardized or uniform to move on now from this juncture we're at, where we want to provide or offer a decolonized syllabus, for instance, of the Holocaust?
Look, this is, we have to be clear. The genocide in Gaza is ongoing. And when I say the genocide in Gaza, what I really mean is the genocide in Palestine. And the genocide is Palestine, which is extended, of course, now into Lebanon, actually. I mean, it's the same army, it's the same state, it's the same soldiers, it's the same army units in some cases, right? In Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in Lebanon now. It's the same methods, right? Bombing of hospitals, of journalists, of healthcare workers. Uh, um, um, so, we have to think about Israeli genocide. I mean, we can't continue actually to talk about Israel's genocide in Gaza kind of in isolation, which was never actually the right way to think about it at all. And it's ongoing. It's ongoing in Gaza, actually. And it's certainly escalating in a frightening and horrifically violent way in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. What Israel is doing now in Lebanon has clear marks of Israel genocidal modes of operation. Uh, um, and I say all this because, you know, I think we're not now we're at the point of how do we engage in the struggle to stop this, right? We're not yet at the point of how do we, I mean, it's very difficult today to do anything actually, right? To think, to, to breathe, to, the constant atrocities and the violence, and not only in Palestine, Israel, and not only in the region, with this current Israeli and American attack on Iran, as well. But what's happening in Sudan. I mean, the think about what it means that people can see, you know, blood-stained sand from space of massacres in Sudan, right? In Ukraine, we have the longest land war in Europe, ongoing since 2022, and in some way, really since 2014, right? Um, uh, uh, I mean, the we are in a point of crisis that is not at all clear how it will, I mean, and it's not at all clear how we will come out of it, right? Um, and I'm not even talking about probably the major crisis that's facing that everyone in the world is facing, that is climate change and global warming, right? If we want to add this into our discussion, actually, probably the most burning issue also in the study of genocide, right? But uh, uh, so what I'm mentioning all of this because, it's very difficult to actually think in a really specific way about the future of Holocaust education when we're in the midst of this crisis where, and this is the key point, right? Holocaust education is continuously weaponized, again, by the state level, in this unfolding and ongoing violence all the time, right? Palestinians are Nazis, Iranians are Nazis, uh, um, right? Ukrainians are Nazis. I mean, there's a Putin element to this, which of course is rooted, of course, again, also in a history of portraying Ukrainians as Nazis from immediately after World War II, from during World War II, right? I mean, so there's histories to that as well. But it's very difficult. And of course, within another context that's tied to this unfolding and ongoing violence of an unbelievable attack on the academic world in the United States, in the West more broadly, really around the world, right? So the idea of academic freedom, the idea of an open society in the United States, in Europe as well, is really, I mean, we can't anymore say that, that we're in danger of. We are in the process where we are already in many ways living in an authoritarian society and state in the United States, right? Um, where, intimidation, firing faculty members is very much happening. It has been happening for quite a long time, certainly in the last 2.5 years. Um, so it's very difficult to, we're silencing, every day there's like examples, right? I just saw yesterday an example. There's, I think, a faculty member in Lafayette, I think, which university, which was the university required her to remove from her office door pro-Palestinian and, posters and leaflets and things like that on her office door, right? Uh, um, which is, but again, constantly cancellation of courses, again, intimidation that creates a lot of self-censorship. Of course, people are afraid, and for very good reason, right? So it's very difficult in this context of an unbelievable attack on the academic world as well, right? Where, and this is yet, kind of a third element here that's very important to keep in mind, where one of the key uh, tools, right, of the attack in the academic world is the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, right? The weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, right? So the use of the concept of anti-Semitism, shifting it completely to basically now any criticism of the Israeli state, of course, including the idea that Israel is perpetrating genocide in Gaza, but any criticism of Israel is now anti-Semitism, and nothing else is really. So the very, real rise in anti-Semitism, which we see primarily on the right, which we've always seen primarily on the right, which have always been tied to white supremacy, which has always been tied to neo-Nazis, which has always been tied to nationalists, right? That, of course, does not matter because these are people who are aligned with with Israel and with the Israeli state project, right? So the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism as a key element of the attack against the academic world within the academic world. And this is an attack that comes from outside, but also from within the academic world, right? Senior administrators, presidents, provosts, deans, who are very much aligned with this attack, together with the ongoing violence and really a massive, massive crisis in the international system, where the international legal system is kind of disintegrating in front of our eyes, where international institutes like the United Nations are becoming completely irrelevant, right, and bankrupt in any case. All this makes it incredible difficult to talk in a specific way about the future of Holocaust education. Uh, you know, um, I do have, nevertheless, a couple things that I would like to say about this, but I don't know if you want to jump in with any comment or question.
No, please go ahead. We do have
So
a few more questions. Yes.
yeah, I mean the one thing that I really would like to say in this sense is that a thing that guides me, okay, and I hope guides many others, is that we should be uncompromising, radical, if we want to use that word, in our insistence on truth, right? Truth is under unbelievable attack, right? Um, Now think about it. Today, more than half of American Jews, so we're talking about millions of people, more than half of American Jews think that Israel is perpetrating genocide in Gaza. Okay? Now I mean, some of them that makes them reconsider, say, how they understand themselves as Zionists. Some of them not. It doesn't really matter in that sense. This or the other, more than half of them think that Israel is perpetrating genocide in Gaza. The response of Israel and its supporters, right, is that saying that Israel is perpetrating genocide in Gaza is a blood libel. So now we're in this crazy lunatic situation where millions of Jews are accused of a blood libel. And this is just one example of a world turned upside down. Now, it's important to say, this is what genocidaires always do. They're, the project of genocide is about creating a world upside down, right? Where victims, where people targeted for genocide are presented as evil, as dangerous. That's how Nazis saw Jews, right? As evil and dangerous, right? And themselves as righteous. That is a key element of genocide, always creating a world turned upside down. This, accusing millions of Jews of a blood libel for saying what is a consensus among human rights organizations and genocide scholars and international law experts now, that Israel is perpetrating a genocide in Gaza, right? That is a manifestation of the world turned upside down. And in any kind of way that we should be thinking about the future of Holocaust education, a radical insistence on truth, right, has to be a component of this. That's one thing. The other thing is that there are, you know, uh, unfortunately, I think that among Holocaust scholars, specifically Holocaust scholars and scholars in that sometimes there's an overlap with scholars in Jewish studies. By no means not everyone, but a very significant number of Holocaust scholars, right, have burned all bridges. What do I mean? When people decided that they are providing support and legitimacy for for an extremely violent state, to the point that they also legitimize the targeting, in this case of Palestinians in Gaza, um, I don't see any way to come back for that. What do I mean? I'll give you an example. In November 2023, a number of Holocaust scholars, including Avinoam Pat here in the United States, including Dina Porat in Israel, Lara Yokush, also in the United States, and others, wrote a piece in Haaretz, okay, November 2023, which was actually a response to an article by Omer Bartov, okay, rejecting completely the idea that Israel is actually perpetrating mass atrocities. I mean, it wasn't even really only about the discussion about genocide. Omer Bartov in November 2023, if you remember, had not yet argued that Israel is perpetrating genocide in Gaza. This will come only later in May 2023. In Omer's view, I think that he was wrong, but that's a different discussion. But these scholars, and I think there were 5 scholars on this piece, part of their argument with Omer, for instance, reproduced the idea, this image that we know was a crude falsification of reality of the 40 beheaded babies in the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, which never happened. We know that it never happened. We know that this is, very classic case of atrocity propaganda that is meant to justify atrocities, and in this case, genocide. But they decided to reproduce it in their piece in November 2023, when even Israel, by the way, if you remember, had already acknowledged that it never happened, right? There is no coming back from that, right? There's simply no coming back from such a position. And I mention this because when we think about the future of Holocaust education, right, when we think about this idea of Holocaust studies, I think that Holocaust studies was, again, a very strange field to begin with. But any future of studying the Holocaust, of educating about the Holocaust, of teaching about the Holocaust, right, has to be an insistent on truth. And it cannot, there is no way any longer, right, to include in any good faith effort in Holocaust research, education, and memory, people who have burned their bridges in such a crude way. And unfortunately, there's a lot of them. And that's why I think that this is not just a crisis. A crisis is a very, deceptive word, I think, in this context, right? This is well beyond a crisis. We can actually talk in a very specific way about the death of Holocaust studies, right? In this sense, right? That doesn't mean, the end of studying. There's so much more to study about the Holocaust, actually. As strange as I remember that when I wanted to go and, do a master's about the Holocaust in Jewish history, by the way, in Tel Aviv University, back in 2002. A family member who I had told about my plans, right, told me, studying the Holocaust, don't we know everything we need to know about the Holocaust, right? Of course not. Not then, and actually not now. Uh, um, so there's much, much more to study about the Holocaust. It's important to continue to study about the Holocaust. This is my, studying the Jewish world and the Holocaust is my field, is my primary field of interest, right? Teaching about the Holocaust is something that I've been doing for the last 20 years, right? Engaging with, a Holocaust memory in various ways, very, very important. Holocaust studies as a field, that's probably dead, right? Or it should be dead, right? And we should think, and that's why I say it's not about, it's about a complete transformation, right? In that sense. So again, I don't have much more to say, in specific ways about how this future of Holocaust studies, education, memory might look like or should look like, in my view, right? Because of all these,
Yeah.
it's difficult to think through it. But I just wanted to mention these,
Yeah.
few points.
I mean, what I have seen so far, and again, I have many questions, but I want to stick to this title about, teaching the Holocaust after Gaza. What I have noticed is that I have many scholars we've spoken to have proposed different things. Like we have one scholar who said he is introducing the Nakba alongside the Holocaust while he teaches the Holocaust as well. So these are, if you want, practical ways in which we are changing our approach to teaching the Holocaust now. My question is, because of your seniority in the field, are you aware of any existing groups that are actively working on devising something new going ahead from this point?
Look, I'll say a couple of things. One, we should stop using this after Gaza. We are within the process, right? We're not after
Yes.
anything.
Yeah.
For me, always, well before October 2023, teaching the Holocaust was in opposition to the ideological and the state framework. Always, right? For me,
Hmm.
I mean, always. For a long time, I'd say, I mean, actually, yes, always since I've been teaching this, basically, which started really. I started teaching this at the University of Haifa back in 2012, even before I completed my PhD. But and what do I mean by that? My Holocaust courses have always been basically about the making of the modern and the late modern world. Okay, and the question is, why is the modern and late modern world this era of genocide, right? Um, and in that sense, my courses are always about colonialism, right? My courses are always about the nation state system because we can't understand. I mean, without colonialism, without the nation state system, there's no Nazis and there's no Holocaust, right? So it has to be about colonialism. It has to be about the nation state system. In that sense, of course, it's comparative, right? But it's not really comparative in the kind of straightforward way. Yes, we deal with similarities and differences between different cases, right? But it's also integrative, right? It looks at genocide, right, not as these kinds of bursts in an otherwise, say, history of modern progress, right? No, genocide is a systemic structural problem. It's a systemic structural problem because of colonialism, because of the nation state system. And I always tell students the problem, the problem is that after the Holocaust, the structures of mass that led us to the Holocaust, that is colonialism and settler colonialism and the nation state system, it's not that no one came to terms with them, it's that they were reproduced. And by the way, where were they reproduced in the most shocking way? In the Israeli state project, which is at an intersection of a colonial and settler, self-proclaimed colonial state and a nation state of the Jews, right? So, and I tell students that's the problem. That's why our world looks like it looks like. I tell them to study the Holocaust. I mean, one of the reasons we have a field like Holocaust studies in the United States, like we have it, is because it was perceived for a long time as safe, right? We are the good guys. Studying the Holocaust gives us a warm feeling here, right? Uh, uh, um, but studying the Holocaust is exactly the opposite, right? Studying the Holocaust is about the United States as a settler colonial state founded on genocide that inspired the Nazis. That's studying the Holocaust, right? That's how I've been teaching the Holocaust always. Well before October 2023, the Nakba has always featured in my Holocaust. I don't know how to teach the Holocaust any other way. Any other way would be ridiculous, right? Completely decontextualized, unrelated to how history unfolded, unrelated to the testimonies of survivors. Many of them, their story doesn't stop in 1945, right? It continues into, right, immigration to Palestine, Israel, into the 1948 war, into life in Israel afterwards, right? Uh, um, that's another issue, how we've never really been listening to the voices of survivors unless they tell us what we want to hear in, like, these kind of limited sections, right? Uh, uh, um, uh, so in that sense, for me, now, the problem, of course, is that all this is now under attack, right? And it's under attack in a broader framework of, as I said, of the attack against the academic world. Um, uh, but for me, teaching the Holocaust has always been that, and I urge, and again, I'm always, I'm always interested to hear how how can you teach the Holocaust, right, without colonialism? Because without colonialism, there is no concept of race. That's where the concept of race emerges, right? Without race, there is no race science, no eugenics. Without eugenics, no Nazis. Without Nazis, no Holocaust. And so how does that happen? Where do you start the story? Right? I mean, for instance, right? Without the nation state system, we don't have actually the violence against Jews during the war in Hungary or in Romania or in Bulgaria, which is a very interesting case in itself, right? So how do you teach about state violence against Jews, say, during World War II, in a case like Hungary, without understanding nationalism and the nation state system?
So I have a question now, since you mentioned, all of the extended stories around the Holocaust that are probably overlooked because, say, they don't fit into the dominant narratives that are out there. And I'm thinking specifically about an interview I watched early on in after October 2023, where Israelis were interviewed who had actually endured the Nakba, and they wanted to speak about the victims that they saw on the Palestinian side, of course, and what they felt, how they felt about them, and they were very sorry for what they had done as perpetrators of these people. Now, I'm just thinking from the perspective of a postdoctoral scholar who's been applying to various universities, including the USHMM, and how among us, among the postdoctoral scholars, the PhD students, there is a running conversation about, well, if you frame it this way, you'll get through, you'll get the grant. If you frame it that way, you won't. And I'm just thinking about how, if I were to mention this to any of my friends, any of my colleagues, and say, I want to do something about the survivors of the Nakba, I want to speak of the survivors of the Holocaust who moved on to Israel, who witnessed the Nakba, my friends would definitely tell me, you won't get through. So I want to come back to something very basic here, which I think is important to bring up in the context, at least in the American context, which is money. Most institutions in this country that provide postdoctoral education in Holocaust and genocide studies are funded by Jewish donors. And many of these people, I'm not saying they're all pro-Israeli or anti-Israeli or whatever it is, but my point is the money is coming from them. Funding doesn't come, for instance, as easily to study other genocides. And that is affecting the research that is being done in the field of the Holocaust. Is this one of the considerations that you have as well when you're thinking largely about this subject?
Look, again, there's a number of things here that I think are significant. The academic world in the United States specifically is nearing its end, we can say. Okay. Some universities will remain, of course, the Ivy Leagues, the Big Tens, large, wealthy universities will survive. But we've already been seeing, and this is, I mean, the attack against the academic world in the United States, of course, has been going on in various ways at least since the 1980s, for various reasons. Now it's just, we're kind of at the culmination of this long process of attack, and we've been seeing for years now, public and private universities, small and medium, closed down across the country, right? And we've been seeing this more, in the last few years, and this is unfortunately, I think, phenomena that will continue and even accelerate. And it's tied to many, other things, and we don't have time to go into it now. I mention it because, of course, if we want to think about, specifically Holocaust scholarship and Holocaust education, then it's part of it, right? And then, of course, it's also tied to funding. But look, first of all, I think there are many other Jewish donors in the United States as well who have other interests and who might be willing to support other kinds of initiatives about Holocaust education that are not about reproducing, right? Uh, uh, um, all the problems basically that have led us that that have led us to our present. Uh, um, so that's one thing. And, I can tell you, I run a master's program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University for a number of years now, and I've raised quite a lot of money to support our students and our programming in this master's program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And people know who I am, right? And I have a number of, I've been quite successful in raising significant amounts of money, specifically for kind of a medium size on the smaller side public university in New Jersey, right? Now, what this means is that what the current kind of multi-layered crisis, including in the academic world, uh, um, means is that, yes, I think we need to think about alternative institutional frameworks to studying the Holocaust, to studying genocide, to studying Palestine, uh, um, outside of the academic world, or at least primarily outside of the academic world, or maybe in kind of remaining islands in the academic world. At this point, probably not in the United States, right? Where there's still an opportunity to do that, right? But I think primarily we need to think about different sources of funding, and as I said, they exist. They definitely exist. Uh, and we have to remember that we don't actually need a lot of funding to do that, right? So I think it's very doable, right? To think about alternative frameworks outside the academic world, organizations, institutes, actually. It's something that some people, including myself, are already engaged in various ways. Again, it's very difficult because of all the problems that I mentioned before, right? Being within this kind of multi-layered crisis, and it's also, uh, uh, um, it is also in Europe, right? There is a massive attack on the truth, right? On talking about Palestine, on talking about Israel's genocide in Gaza. Um, uh, and that attack also has the legal element, right? We're seeing a lot of legislation that incorporates the IRA definition of anti-Semitism as the forefront of this weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism. So there's a lot of obstacles. That's what I'm saying in this, but the future is of, again, of what we can call, what we can studying the Holocaust, remembering the Holocaust, educating about the Holocaust, of course, within the frame of genocide, including Palestine, Israel, including the Nakba, the ongoing Nakba, and Israel's genocide in Palestine, and again, Israel's genocide in Palestine, right? Past and present. This will need to happen, and it's more and more, but it will need to move, right, to alternative frameworks outside, primarily outside of the academic world and outside of the institutes of global Holocaust memory, like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, that, as I've said, there is no coming back, right, from legitimizing genocide. Now, what do we do with, again, there's all kinds of complexities, and we don't have time to go into them because the USHMM has a big archive that scholars need. So there's all kinds of questions to address, and I'm not pretending that any of this is simple or straightforward, right? But I do think that if we insist, and if we take the radical insistence on truth as our point of departure, right, then there's no collaboration that can happen in any way, certainly not now, with an institute like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in this kind of framework of thinking about the future of, studying, teaching, and remembering the Holocaust.
Thank you. And last question from me is your dismissal from the University of Minnesota sparked wide discussion about the political pressures surrounding scholarship on Gaza. How did that experience shape your perspective on the issues we're discussing today?
I mean, that's that's maybe a topic for another interview because it's really there's so much to say about it. Um, uh, but I'll just say that this was a case where one of the things that happened, right, is that there was a attack against me by the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Minnesota and the Dakotas that really sparked the broader campaign against me that eventually led within a few days, right, of the interim president of the university at the time to withdraw the job offer that I received on the 5th of June 2024. And the thing to say that one thing that I just wanted to mention about uh, that attack, which is very interesting, is that, of course, it was a crude violation of First Amendment, right, by the university, a big, very significant public university that decided to withdraw a job offer that happened through an absolutely legitimate and detailed search process uh, solely based on what I said and wrote on Israel's genocide in Gaza within a professional capacity as a scholar in the field, right? So a crude violation of academic freedom, a crude violation of First Amendment rights, which tells us everything we need to know about what we've been talking here, right? Which is the crude attack on the truth and also the attack on the academic world. But the issue about the kind of this crude violation of First Amendment rights also tells us about the, kind of the moment in which we're in, where we're seeing massive violations by the state, by the U.S. state itself, of its own constitution. I mean, you can think about, of course, the U.S. initiating this attack on Iran without any congressional process, right? Which is, another clear violation of the U.S. Constitution, and there are many other examples, right, to this. So I just wanted to, note these elements, right? This violation of constitutional rights, violation of academic freedom, a crude attack on truth that also happened in what happened to me in with the University of Minnesota back in 2024. But again, there's so much more to say about this, and it's probably a separate interview.
And thank you so much, Raz, for your time. We really appreciate it. I have just one question for you. We like to bring in questions from scholars in the field and past guests on the podcast. Today's question comes from Professor Edward Westermann, who is currently serving as the Theodor Tsev and Alice R. Weiss Holocaust Educational Foundation Chair in Holocaust Studies at Northwestern University. And he asks, in looking at the intertangled history of Jews and Palestinians in the Levant, each side references an individual catastrophe, the Shoah on the one hand and the Nakba on the other. How should educators approach these two events in the classroom, and what teaching strategies can be employed to bring these two national traumas into conversation with one another? And furthermore, what do you see as the key points of similarity and difference between the two?
I mean, there's no time now to go into a comparison, right, between the Holocaust and the Nakba. Um, I would say this, you know, I think that I would say one thing. There's so much to say about this question, and again, that also is a separate interview, I think. But I would only say this. One of the key lessons of Holocaust education, this is the common sense realm, right? Now, not the state realm, was the to center the voices and the perspectives, the knowledge of those who faced the violence. Now, we've never really done that. We've never really done that. we've listened to some survivors when they told us what we wanted to hear, and it was usually very prominent men, and it was usually very prominent men tied to prominent institutions, right? But really listening to the complexity, and it's multiple voices, contradictory with a lot of complexities, right, of people who had faced the violence. We've never really done that. Now, we have collected immense data, tens of thousands of testimonies and memoirs, which are, of course, not representative, right, statistically or in other ways of all the victims of Nazi genocides, right? But we have immense data, right? We can say that, tens of thousands of testimonies and memoirs. We don't actually have knowledge production on a comparable scale. That is, for instance, we don't have anything like a people's history of the Holocaust, actually. A large-scale account that is really based on, which would require, of course, a team of scholars, right? Really based on the voices and the perspectives and the knowledge of survivors. We can say the same thing about the Nakba, by the way, and about the ongoing Nakba, right? If we center the voices of those who faced violence, we center the voices of people who face violence, including Palestinians, right? I would say that this is the way to approach it, right? Pedagogically, in a classroom, bring in the complexity of voices, Jews and Palestinians, right? If we want to really think, and again, I do this in some way in my teaching as well. But this is also something to think about. Before I said there's so much more to study, to research the Holocaust. This is one way to think about it, right? To really take seriously what we haven't actually taken seriously, right? And there, from the, we can think about some very important scholarship, both on the Holocaust and on the Nakba, that did take seriously the voices of survivors, but not much, actually, not a lot of scholarship, right? From these cases, right, we can think about the board works, path-breaking work, well, in the past about Children of the Star, right? For instance, we can think about Adel Mana's work on the Nakba and its aftermath in the north of Palestine, in the Galil, right? From these works, we can see the enormous benefits, the new insights that emerge from these works. And we can see that, this is one way to think about the Holocaust and the Nakba together, bring in the voices of people who faced the violence, right? And that's a way to do this in the classroom, and that's a way for, perhaps future research projects. We desperately actually need a people's history of the Holocaust, and we don't have it yet.
We ask our guests to share a small number of reading recommendations. Are there one or two books that have shaped your thinking on this topic and that you would recommend to someone seeking a deeper understanding of it?
It's so difficult to to raise just just a couple examples. But if so we're talking about the Holocaust and the Nakba in this sense, right? I think that if I find Nadira Sharab-Kevorkian's scholarship on specifically on Israel's attack against children in her book from a few years ago on unchilding, very, very important, again, on Israel's attack against Palestinian children. There's also a chapter there. This was a book that was published before October 2023. There's also a chapter there actually on Gaza, which is very, very important and become particularly important after October 2023. I think that in terms of the Holocaust, it's really interesting, right? That and this is, so I'm actually grateful for the question, because when we think about the Holocaust, this massive crisis is happening while we actually have tremendously important and new research that's coming out on the Holocaust. And I'm thinking, for example, about Anna Haikova's work on queer Jews during the Holocaust, the first work of its kind. 2025, 2026, right? The first time that we have a serious, significant engagement with queer Jews in the Holocaust. I'm talking about her book that was just came out in English, translation of the German People Without History Are Dust, right? We can think about Dagmar Herzog's new book on Nazi euthanasia that just came out. I don't remember the title off the top of my head right now, even though actually I've already used it with graduate students. And I'm not sure that Dagmar Herzog would actually define herself actually as a Holocaust scholar, but certainly a scholar of Nazism. But her book on Nazi euthanasia that just came out, incredibly important. Also, we might ask ourselves, how is it that in such a book, that no such book appears until 2025? But the fact of the matter is that we have really, really significant scholarship in various, from various perspectives on a range of issues. I can think about, Kobi Kabalik's recent book on, resistance and memory in Germany and many others. But this shows us that there is actually an urgent need to continue to study the Holocaust. And there's great research that's coming out. But all this research in various ways, and again, we don't have time to go into it, challenges actually the kind of state perspectives, which also then throws into sharp relief how we need these alternative institutional frameworks and indeed alternative funding, but it's much less money than people imagine in order to continue to do this, to create, to realize this transformation that is really badly needed in order to bring about somehow through these, unbelievable multiple crises, a future of the study of genocide, of the Holocaust, of the Nakba, and inshallah, a different kind of world.
This was Not to Forgive, but to Understand, with our guest, Raz Segal. To our listeners, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more discussions.